the changing agricultural scene and very often agent provocateur. What the farmer expects from his banker. Oliver Walston.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I came up on the stage after lunch when we were practicing or being shown what this was like, I was asked whether I had any overheads for that projector, and I said no, I had no overheads but very high fixed costs. What do I expect from my bank manager? I'd actually written this enormously exciting and important and deeply profound speech on what I wanted from my bank manager, and as I was sitting down just now I realized that the actual text is what I expect from my bank manager. The two, of course, are very different. I expect a cup of tea once every 7 years. I want love, respect, but above all flattery. I love flattery. I've never found flattery to be anything other than utterly convincing. At the age of 30, I became a farmer, having previously been a paid employee of a publishing company. I'd always wanted to be a farmer, but in those days my brother was doing the farming, and on 3,000 acres he reckoned there was only room for one of us. For some inexplicable, or rather explicable reason, I now seem to agree with him. However, fulfilling my life's ambition to be a farmer wasn't a particularly notable achievement, since I'd been born with a silver spoon not just in my mouth, but in every other available orifice. Being an arable farmer back in 1972 didn't really involve or even require the presence of a bank manager, even though the farm did run a permanent overdraft and never went into credit. Arable farming, like independent television, in the words of Lord Thompson, was a license to print money. Now, today, of course, using the hindsight for which we farmers have become famous, we can recognize how fortunate we were throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. But at the time, we sang a very different song. Did the agricultural press echo with grateful farmers thanking the politicians and the taxpayers, and indeed the bank managers, assuming they pay tax, unlike their farming clients, for their generosity? Did the NFU admit its extraordinary good fortune? Did anyone in the entire industry have the grace or even the common sense, at least to keep quiet? No. On the contrary, throughout this golden age of arable farming, the loudest noise in the countryside was the sound of farmers bemoaning their fate. With each succeeding year, the agricultural lobby grew ever more vociferous as it told a bewildered public that unless prices were raised, the industry would go bankrupt and Europe would certainly starve. The campaign was brilliantly successful, as you probably remember. Intervention prices, which had been devised to provide a safety net to prevent widespread bankruptcy, crept ever upwards, until at the end of the period they were actually above the market price. In the lunatic asylum called the Common Agricultural Policy, the floor had become a ceiling. The world, at least my little world, was upside down. Now, prices weren't the only cause of British farmers' discontent. There were, of course, the usual wails about the bad weather, the unfair competition from abroad, and impending disaster from a multitude of sources. Of course, our ideas as farmers about what was unfair need a bit of explanation. It was, for example, perfectly fair for a farmer to buy cheap weed killer from France, but it was grossly unfair for cheap French poultry to be sold to English consumers. Grey imports of tractors from Belgium, i.e. the ones that bypassed the official manufacturer's agents, were considered well within the norms of free enterprise. But Danish bacon and French golden delicious apples were objected to as a violation of free competition. To a farmer, fairness has always been a very flexible concept. Today, with the benefit of history, we can look back nostalgically to an age when even the worst arable farmer could make money. The good ones made small fortunes, and the excellent farmers became very rich indeed. Incompetence alone was not a reason to lose money. No, to do this with any certainty, you needed to be more than just incompetent. You needed to have an extravagant wife and an addiction to roulette. Provided a man got up before midday, managed to scatter a few seeds in the autumn, and was prepared to harvest the crop the following summer, there was no way an arable farmer could fail to make a profit. Now, I entered farming in 1972. In the following decade, I simply couldn't understand the old fuddy-duddies who were constantly harping back to the bad old days of the 1930s. Farming, for me anyway, was an absolute doddle. I should have realized, of course, that human beings' attitudes are invariably formed by their early experiences, and thus the men who'd grown up in the 1930s remained cautious and pessimistic for the rest of their lives, while I, a child of the booming 70s, agriculturally speaking a child, I was actually a child somewhat few decades before that, I, a child of the booming 70s, was optimism personified, and for a decade or so I had figures to show that I was right. My biggest problem was what to do with the profits I kept making. However, the solution was exceedingly simple, even without referring to John Nix. I converted them into machinery by taking advantage of the 100% tax write-offs which we were allowed then. Of course, there was one slight disadvantage. The bank overdraft kept rising as I borrowed more and more to fund the purchases of bigger and bigger equipment. Tractors, combines, grain stores, grain dryers came in profusion. And just as I felt I should stop investing and possibly concentrate on reducing my borrowings, along came Brussels with what they call the Farm and Horticulture Development Scheme, which gave me even bigger capital grants to encourage still more investment. As a result, I bought more lorries and more tractors with even greater abandon, safe in the knowledge that I was doing precisely what the common market wanted me to do. No wonder the machinery trade had to ration tractor deliveries as other farmers competed with me to buy everything the factories could turn out. It was in this climate that I first clapped eyes on my bank manager. You laugh, I cry. The old farm secretary, who had seen the clerical staff on the farm decline from 5 to himself alone, used to spend weeks every autumn making out what he called a budget, but what we would today call a cash flow forecast. It was done with enormous love and care on lined paper, with the figures in black ballpoint, underlined in green, and the overdraft figures naturally written in red. Now today, in April 1990, what I've just described seems almost like a fairy tale, or at least like the ancient history of a distant planet. In the past decade, the whole farming landscape has altered immeasurably. Today, I find myself faced with a problem, not of how to spend my profits, but how to survive. And it isn't a pleasant feeling. But for me anyway, it isn't an entirely new one either. Because I can remember the moment when I first realized that things weren't quite as they seemed to be. For St. Paul, who had a similar experience, it happened on the way to Damascus. For me, it was on the way to Nebraska, in the middle of the United States of America. I'd gone to Nebraska because I'd read somewhere, and in those days I tended to believe what I read in the farming press. Now it's because I write it, I know perfectly well it's rubbish. Anyway, I'd gone to Nebraska because I had read that farmers there and in the neighboring state of Iowa were going bankrupt in droves. Conditioned as I was by the CAP, I found this hard to believe, so I made a special request to the Farm Bureau, which is roughly the equivalent of the National Farmers Union, to meet some of these bankrupt farmers. I felt it would certainly be interesting, conceivably instructive, if I could actually speak to people who'd failed to keep their farms afloat. I expected, of course, to meet a bunch of incompetents. A group of people who never got out of bed before 10 in the morning, who planted their seeds a few weeks later than their neighbors, who forgot to spray for weeds, and who never managed to combine a crop before it rained. In other words, I expected to meet some spectacularly bad farmers. As usual, I was wrong. The bankrupt farmers of Nebraska were actually well above average. They were energetic, keen, and had good track records. It wasn't their farming which was at fault, it was simply their enthusiasm. You might call it their judgment. Such was their desire to expand their farms, to put up a new silo or milking parlour, to buy more land or a bigger tractor, that they'd borrowed too much money. They were, in that jargon so beloved of American bankers, over-leveraged. At this point, my bank manager assumed a far greater importance than he'd ever done before. I saw with awful clarity that I too had committed all the sins for which my American colleagues were now paying such a dreadful price. In times of continuous expansion and prosperity, my borrowings looked normal, even restrained. But if, as seemed likely, the party was over and the future looked grim, my borrowings looked very similar to those of the men with whom I had commiserated outside Lincoln, Nebraska. I returned to England a shaken man and resolved to treat my bank manager with care and even respect. Although sometimes that's difficult. In the past, that's an interesting comment from you as well. In the past, after presenting him with my cash flow forecast, I'd filed the piece of paper away and ignored it because it had never occurred to me to monitor my cash flow, actual against budget. Why should I? I knew I was going to make money, and I had better things to do with my time than to mess about with figures just to keep the bank manager happy. Indeed, the bank manager seemed happy enough too. He was quite as keen as I was to limit our meetings to one brief cup of tea per year. By this time, the old farm secretary had long since retired, and in his place, a not very bright but rather attractive young lady had appeared. I realized to my horror that if anyone was going to draw up a cash flow forecast, it would have to be me. Aided by a computer, I was able to start making the most elaborate spreadsheets, which kept me occupied for hours every night. Today, we have four computers in the office, which for one person I think is just about enough. I happen to be besotted by computers, but that, as they say, is another story. This whole process coincided with the end of the golden years of arable farming. Scarred and very frightened by my experience in Nebraska, I began to take some pretty drastic steps. Out went the Porsche, out went the nanny and the nanny's VW Polo, out went my father's gardener, and all of his perks too. That wasn't good news. Down came the staff from 17 in 1984 to 6 today. You see, if I'm going to survive in the next few years, there's one thing and one thing alone I'll have to do, and that is to cut my fixed costs. And this all boils down to the fact that the first person to suffer must be the farmer himself, and the next person is the farmer's family, and then, and only then, should the farmer start to make economies in other areas. Hence the fact, as I said, that we now employ 6 men on 3,000 acres, when 6 years ago we used to employ 17. Now, the interesting thing is, had you asked me back in 1984 whether this would be possible, I would have denied it with characteristic vehemence, which with stupid men like me is normally a substitute for knowledge. The farm, I would have told you then, would undoubtedly suffer, and the pressure on my job would become intolerable. As usual, you're beginning to see a pattern in this. I was wrong. The farm has not suffered. The crops are no worse. We use no more outside help than we used to. There are, admittedly, a few changes. The place does look slightly scruffier. The office phone is answered by a machine and not a human. But the amazing fact is that my job, far from being more difficult, is actually a lot easier. It is, I've discovered, far simpler to manage 6 people than 17. But of course, the wages bill alone won't suffice if one's to get costs down fast. The quickest way to do this is what we and most other farmers have done. We've simply ceased to buy capital equipment. In my case, we were perhaps fortunate in that during the good years we spent far too much on equipment and were grossly overcapitalized. And this has meant that we found it all very easy to go on a crash diet for the past 4 years by living off our fat. It's done wonders for the overdraft and is probably the biggest single reason why we're now in credit for 6 months of the year instead of being overdrawn for 12 months. However, like all diets, it can't continue forever, and the day is now getting near when we shall have to replace some of this machinery. However, as a short-term, once-and-for-all measure, it was wonderful and almost painless. Now, the one thing we haven't done is to do what all fashionable bankers, including, I assume, NatWest and ADAS advisors have long been preaching. We have not diversified. You've probably heard that word before. We have not diversified. It's true we have a small livery stable in a redundant building which brings in about 5,000 quid a year. And come to think of it, I'm diversifying, standing up here talking to you distinguished gentlemen and lady. And that, I suppose, is diversification of a sort. Happily, the market for this sort of thing is very limited. There's just John Nixon and me, really. And I talk for longer and charge less, so... But the important thing is we haven't opened a farm shop or started a new enterprise which requires capital, labour and expertise. And in fact, only a very few farms are really suited to that sort of thing. It might, I suppose, make sense if you opened a farm shop, if you happen to live on the edge of Coventry and your sister's, cousins, brother's aunt is the head of the planning department. But for the rest of us, I have to tell you that diversification is nothing more nor less than an irrelevance, and usually an expensive one at that. My future, like that of most arable farmers, will lie in extensifying rather than intensifying. Thus, I shall increasingly farm as they do in Saskatchewan or Kansas, where Dad and 2 sons happily look after 3,000 acres. Now, so much for my own particular history. You didn't come here to listen to my autobiography. You came here this afternoon to find out what I want or expected from my banker. And of course, the first thing I want from him is, of course, money. And the second thing is a very low interest rate. But enough of my dreams, let's get down to reality. Bank managers have always reminded me of grain loss monitors on a combine harvester. And for those of you who don't know what a grain loss monitor is, I'd better explain. It's a gadget which sits in the driver's cab and tells him when to slow down and when to speed up. At least, that's what it's meant to do. It works by measuring the amount of grain coming out the back of the straw. Remember, the purpose of a combine, for all of you NatWest livestock people in the Northwest who haven't the slightest idea about grain, I have to explain this in some detail. The purpose of a combine is to separate the grain from the straw and to put the former in a tank and the latter on the ground. When there is too much grain, the red light comes on and the driver slows down, or is meant to. When there's very little grain coming out of the back with straw, the green light flashes and the driver puts his foot on the accelerator. But there is one enormous snag to a grain loss monitor. Instead of demonstrating that unless the driver slows down now, he will start throwing too much grain out of the back, what it actually does is to show the driver that it is already throwing too much grain out of the back. It's a bit like having a machine in your car which lets off an alarm when you're speeding in a 30-mile-an-hour limit. Very useful in theory at least, but if in reality all it did was to say, you have been speeding and are now about to be arrested, nobody would be very interested in buying such a gadget. Bank managers, like the rest of the human race, tend to be wise after the event. They also tend to have very short memories, but so do solicitors, accountants, and all other professional advisors too. Let me explain what this dreadful insult really means. Back in the good old days when I bought land, I never found it hard to find a bank or an AMC to lend me money. Land was clearly a magnificent investment because not only did its capital value appreciate steadily, but as a farmer I could actually make use of it to expand my business and reduce my unit cost of production. Thus, it isn't surprising that I was exceedingly pleased with myself when I bought my first bit of land for £1,000 an acre back in 1975 and watched it double in value within 3 years. I bought some more land at £1,600 an acre and some more at £2,300 an acre. It was clear to me that I was one of the shrewdest and quite possibly the shrewdest investor in England at the time. And what's more, my bank manager agreed with me. At least, I assume he agreed with me. He was jolly keen to lend me the money to pay for these silly prices. And then what happened? The years passed and the price of land began to fall. Now, I'm so stupid, I only buy land when the price is high. It's one of the reasons I'm not a very good investor. So I immediately stopped buying when the price fell. As the value sank lower and lower, and year succeeded year, I began to notice a strange thing about my family, friends, and advisors. Gradually it became clear that they had all been against my buying the land in the first place. Even my father came to the conclusion that he'd never been keen on the idea of paying all that money for those few acres. The bank manager was no exception, but being a bank manager, he was very polite about it. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not blaming the bank manager for my own mistakes. I'm not whinging that it was all the bank's fault, and I have no patience with farmers who get into difficulties and then turn around and blame the bank for lending them the money in the first place. To do this is like blaming the publican when you become an alcoholic or the baker when you become overweight. Farmers, as I've mentioned, tend to blame the rest of the world before they blame themselves. So what am I going to do? And what do I really want from you, the bankers? Well, the first thing I want from a banker is prudence and caution. These, as you know all too well, are commodities not hard to find in the banking world, and long may it remain so. The second thing I want, and this may perhaps conflict with the first, is a bit of sympathy. Not too much, mind you, but just enough so that if things ever really do get tight, I'll at least get the benefit of the doubt. And the best way I can ensure this is by making my business, and indeed myself personally, well known to the bank manager. This means I have to cultivate him quite as assiduously as I do one of my fields. I keep him in the picture and tell him my triumphs, a splendid wheat yield, my disasters, a futures contract which went badly wrong, or just my worries. I pop in to see him from time to time on the flimsiest of pretexts, including wishing him a Happy New Year after Christmas. And if that isn't a flimsy pretext, I can't think of one that is. All of this means that he knows who I am and what my face looks like and whether I'm a reasonable chap. Thirdly, and probably most important of all, I want something which he is not going to give me today. Maybe this is because I bank with the wrong bank. It isn't the NatWest. What I want to be told is where my business is and how it compares with others. In other words, I want to know where in the league table of farming my farm stands. And let me be specific. You bankers have various criteria against which you measure the health of any business. I don't pretend to know what these are in detail. But any half-decent bank manager can take a look at a set of accounts and a balance sheet and within a minute have a fair picture of whether the business is in good or bad shape. What I want to know is how my business stands compared to similar businesses. On a per acre basis, do I borrow more working capital than most? Do I provide more or less of the fixed capital than most? Are my fixed costs higher or lower than average? Is my overdraft bigger or smaller than average? Is my return on capital good or bad? Are my labour costs high or low? Now, you chaps see the accounts of your customers each year, and it wouldn't take much effort to extract this data, put it onto a spreadsheet, and get your computer to analyse the results. Every year, you could then send this league table to your clients, so they would know whether they're doing well or badly. You don't have to mention their names. You can all have numbers, although it'd be much more fun to know the names. This would provide a real service because today we farmers just don't have a clue. And part of the reason is that our fellow farmers, like peasants throughout the world, continue to be obsessed about secrecy. Thus, we'll all tell a pack of lies to each other when we boast about our yields last harvest, but we never remotely dare to compare the sort of figures which really matter. You, on the other hand, standing in the middle of the industry, could do this easily, and you'd earn the profound gratitude of your customers, or at least this particular customer. So I need, in other words, 1, credit, 2, 1% over base, 3, guidance in advance and not with hindsight, 4, sympathy, 5, a knowledge of how my business compares to the rest of the industry. But lastly, however, I would like a bit more knowledge and understanding from my banker. I'd like him to be, at very least, familiar with the way that agriculture works. Now, this may sound a simple request, and so it is. But the fact remains that too many bank managers simply don't have a clue when it comes to the nitty-gritties of farming. They know that milk comes from a cow, probably towards the back end as well. And they're probably aware that tractors pull machinery and cost a lot. But they don't usually know a lot more than that. In America, they tell the story about the banker who, clad in his pinstripes and black shiny shoes, is eventually, and very reluctantly, lured onto the farm of one of his customers just to show goodwill. And as he walks around the farmyard, he pauses and looks down. To his horror, he sees that he's standing right in the middle of a very large and exceedingly liquid cowpat. A look of terror comes across the banker's face. "My God," he says, "I'm melting." The solution, therefore, is very straightforward. Bank managers should spend a bit more time with farmers on the farm. They should do what my bank manager, God bless him, does, and spend an afternoon with me every year. We have a good lunch and then wander around looking at the crops and the machinery, and after a few years of this routine, he's at least dimly familiar with the fact that wheat is harvested in August and sugar beet a few months later. But wandering around the farm, although a start, won't actually be enough. You really ought to make an effort to mix with farmers at all levels. There are different levels amongst farmers, they're not all... Anyway. You should, for example, make contact with your county NFU secretary and tell him you'd like to know a bit about farming in the area. Assuming the shock doesn't kill him, he'll be overjoyed to put you in touch with some interesting farmers. I've met about 3 interesting farmers in my life, but no, that's another story. And I'm one of them. Get yourself invited to an NFU branch meeting and, rather more interesting, to the local agricultural discussion society, of which there are millions. In other words, you chaps must break down the barriers which undoubtedly exist twixt farmer and banker. If you wait for the farmers to do this, you'll still be waiting when you retire. Peasants the world over, and never forget that even the biggest and richest farmer is still a peasant at heart, are always a wee bit frightened of bankers, and I'm no exception. So come on out of your offices and get onto the farms. If I dare stand up in front of you lot, you shouldn't have any troubles chatting up a peasant or two. And you might even enjoy it. I know I have.
And he ran precisely to time. Excellent. Well, we've got just a few minutes now for some questions to Oliver, and I'm sure from what he's said and the obviously very positive reception he's received, there must be quite a few topics that you'd like to raise. So, without further ado, could I take a question, please?
Could I ask our speaker what car replaced the Porsche, please?
This is an outrageous and unwarranted intrusion into my private affairs. However, the answer was a series. First of all, nothing. That was the really bad times. Secondly, then a Volkswagen Golf. And now I drive a small 190 Mercedes, the one with the large engine, admittedly. And if you wish to know the relative prosperity of East Anglian arable farmers, just check on what car I'm driving. There's a very close correlation.
And on a lighter note, perhaps we can have another question.
Do you like continuity from your bankers, Mr. Walston?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Do I what?
Do you like continuity with your bank manager? We tend to move around a little bit. Do you like to see the same chap year in, year out?
Yes, I'm very keen on continuity. The last bank manager I had retired a year ago after I think it was 10 years. And I'm glad he's not here because his ears were burning. I felt very unhappy when he retired because I felt that I'd got to know him a little bit. Yes, continuity is nice, but low interest rates are even nicer. They are. I mean, it was a serious question. It deserves a serious answer. Yes, I do like continuity, very much indeed.
Good. Yes, in front. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, subject to the payment of a good fee from you, we're quite happy to come onto your farm. What really do you expect of a banker when he comes to the farm?
I think it's a difficult one because I accept the fact that a bank manager cannot be an expert in all the industries to which he lends money, and farming is no more nor less than another industry. And so he can't have a detailed knowledge, but a general familiarity, I think, is as much as I can legitimately hope for. And that's where I'd leave it. A general familiarity with my problems without having a detailed knowledge of whether Maris Huntsman is now an outdated variety and Beaver is the new variety of wheat. I would not expect him. Indeed, I'd be marginally suspicious if he knew that, because I'd wonder what he'd been ignoring.
They all do. And the next.
You've mentioned what you expect from your bank manager. I'd be interested to know, because a comment was made earlier about accountants. Do you feel that your accountant has an equally important part to play in the overall management of your farm?
Yes, actually, I think accountants are more important than bank managers. But I think with an accountant, you should change your accountant firm once a generation. Seriously. You didn't ask that question, but I think when son succeeds father, the first thing he should do is to go to a different firm of accountants. But accountants, in my book, are actually more important than bankers. They wouldn't necessarily be. If I was right on the limit of my overdraft, then I don't think I'd sing that song quite. But today, I'm more concerned about what my accountant thinks than my bank manager. Apart from anything else, he does know my business in a lot more detail. And he audits the books and he spends a lot of time talking to me, and I spend a lot of time talking to him, which I think is free until I realize he's got a stopwatch in front of me on the telephone. So I put accountant above bank manager for importance to me today, not tomorrow necessarily.
Fine, thank you, Oliver. We've still got some time in hand. Can we keep it rolling? The next, please. Yes, Malcolm.
Mr. Walston, you mentioned the possibility of being able to compare farms and figures. Does that mean that you would have no objection to your bank manager quoting your figures to your next-door neighbour?
No, as a matter of fact, I don't. I'm one of these very bizarre farmers that does not feel secretive. So to be serious, I wouldn't mind it, although I suspect most farmers would, and therefore I don't think you could legitimately draw up a league table which had names. And you could have to also extract from that league table certain giveaway signs, like if Farmer Walston farms 3,000 acres, the fact that the acreage column says 3,000 would probably be another signal. But I would have no objection whatsoever to my neighbours knowing my figures on condition that I was able to know theirs. But I think if it's a one-way street, then I'd be unhappy because I wouldn't think I was getting a quo for my quid.
You would, of course, appreciate that we would have a problem with breach of confidentiality.
Well, would you if you just talked about farms and gave them each a number or a letter? No. But clearly, I accept the fact, you would probably have to say to your farmer clients, if you are interested in taking part in our league table, please will you send me a letter saying you're okay to do so? And some farmers would say, no, I'm very sorry, I'm not prepared to. They would be the losers, because we simply cannot judge our own performance as businessmen unless you tell us how we're standing.
Does that also mean that you don't have any faith in Professor Nix's figures in his book?
I have total, complete and utter faith, along with the New Testament and the latest Enid Blyton I've been reading. They're the three books that I have total faith in. You wouldn't expect me to tell the truth with the great professor sitting here, would you? Come now. He sends me a free copy every year, and I want him to keep doing it.
I'm getting some very strong non-verbals. Oh, sorry, John, you wanted to come in?
Can you not already get some idea of this from your comparative data, classified by size and type of farm? Michael Murphy does in your particular area, we do in the southeast and so on. I know they come out a bit late and all that.
Yes,
Doesn't that help you in that?
it does slightly. The trouble with Michael Murphy's statistics from Cambridge is they are too voluminous for a simple peasant like me. In other words, there's too much information, and they do come out a little bit late. And they are taken over a very wide area. And one of the things I would like to have is what they have in Schleswig-Holstein in North Germany, where you get groups of farmers, probably 30 in each group, all farming roughly similar types of soil in roughly similar parts of the country. And obviously the more homogeneous, that's a long word for meaning the same, I have to explain, the more homogeneous the farmers are, the more valid the figures are, because it's not really useful for me to be told that compared to a chap in East Lothian, my yields are this, that, or the other. But yes, I mean, what Professor Nick says is true. It is possible, but I would like to get it a finer focus, and I'd like to get the figures out quicker too.
Fine, we've still got a moment or two. Yes, thank you.
I wonder why you want the bank manager to do this job. Surely the NFU are roughly in the same directions as you are. In the same part of the country. Couldn't you get together with the NFU to find out this information?
My feelings about the NFU should really be left to an evening session. They couldn't possibly do it, is the short answer. There aren't many things they could possibly do, but that's it. Whereas the bank manager already has these figures. It isn't a question of asking anybody to provide figures that they don't already provide. All it would involve is, as one of the gentlemen said in the hall, it would involve asking your client's permission to do it. The other people who could do it, of course, are accountants. And as it happens, I persuaded my accountant, which is Spicer and Oppenheim, to do just this. And for the last 2 years, they've now done it at my suggestion. And it's great fun. They now have 55 people in the league table. So, but either accountants or bankers are the only two people who could do it easily and quickly.
Time for just one more. Anybody from... Yes, sir.
Mr. Walston, your requirement was flattery. Yes, we can provide that. Tea, yes. Sympathy, yes, providing you're not whinging. Credit, we do our best on that. Often at 1% and over at base. But can you just talk a little bit more about the grain loss monitor, please? You know, where do we start and where does Mr. McGregor, whom we were listening to earlier, finish?
Yes, I heard John McGregor. I was up in one of these boxes, like somebody from the East German Secret Police checking on the proceedings. I don't know. I mean, I agree that hindsight, which is basically all I was talking about as a grain loss monitor, it was a colourful phrase I thought you might like. Hindsight is inevitable. You only see my results after they've happened, and therefore it is difficult for you to have anything other than hindsight. But you should, maybe I'm being naive, maybe you're not half as clever as I think you are. You should, I would have thought, be able to have a few cast iron indices, indicators, yardsticks, whereby you look at those figures and say, he's doing well, he's doing badly, and he's doing, roughly speaking, okay. I'm sure you have them already. I'm certain that you can look at as I said, you can look at a balance sheet and within seconds have a rough idea, not a precise idea. I'm not that foolish. And all I'm asking you to do is to think forward rather than always think after the event. I repeat, it's easier said than done, but you are in a pivotal position. You have perspective that I don't have. You have knowledge that I don't have, and I'd like you to use both of those more than you're using them at the moment.
Thank you. We could perhaps just slip one quick one in before we break for tea, or... Yes, Stan.
I'll use them.
I'll answer the word sir. I rarely have the bank manager call me sir.
But I spelled it
I've
C-U-R.
never heard a bank manager say that.
There's been press comment recently again on bankers charging for their management time and the arrangements they make. Do you have a view and do you pay them?
No and no. I could shorten that into no. No, being serious, I hadn't read about bank managers charging for their management time. I thought they did. I thought it was called bank charges. But clearly that's insufficient to keep you to the style to which you're rapidly becoming accustomed. But I'd be distressed if my cup of tea cost me money. Directly. I mean, you know, thank you for the cup of tea. That will be £17.50. And I wouldn't pay them. No.
Oliver, thank you sincerely for coming along to speak to us today. I do know that you put off a trip to Eastern Europe to be with us. You know, I hope you've not been disappointed by the alternative of joining us at Heathrop here today.
The food's better here.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So without further ado, as we move towards the tea break, could I just ask you all, please, to show your appreciation to Oliver in the usual manner?